I'm going to take you on a journey of what happens over the course of 60 days of mild sleep deprivation, just a little bit each night, when it comes down to your stomach fat, your belly fat, when it comes down to overall fat oxidation. We're going to talk about how this impacts your metabolism and how it could actually impact what your goals are. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. What happens after just a night or two of poor sleep? Well, with this, we look at a study that was published in the journal Obesity, and it's pretty interesting. They had subjects do 2 nights of normal sleep, and then they had them do 5 nights of restricted sleep, where they brought them down to 5 or 6 hours of sleep for 5 nights. And then they had them do a 12-hour recovery sleep at the end of that. And they compared this to a 10-hour control. Now, I know a lot of us aren't sleeping 10 hours, but it was to get a very solid baseline of super well rested. In the mornings, they measured their resting metabolic rate. And what they found is that the group that was sleep deprived had a 2.6% reduction in their actual resting metabolic rate. That doesn't sound like much, but we're talking after just a day or two, this starts to happen. Their entire ability to burn calories decreases. It's huge. That is a big, big problem, right? Now, what was very good in this is that they found when they had them do the recovery sleep ultimately helped them regain this, and it restored back to normal. Okay, but what happens if we look at more data, specifically after just 1 night of bad sleep? Well, if this, we look at a study that was published in Physiology Reports. Now, this was more extreme. This looked at 1 night of total sleep deprivation. Like if you pulled an all-nighter because you're cramming for something or you just can't sleep, you literally pull an all-nighter, pretty wild. This study found that this decreased muscle protein synthesis 18%. The ability to actually build muscle and repair went down 18%, and a 21% increase in cortisol. So you couple those together, and that's terrible. Not to mention a 24% decrease in testosterone. I mean, I would say the last thing that's on your mind is really procreating when you haven't slept, but still, the fact that all these things together, that's a huge problem. Next, we want to look at what happens after about a week. Let's say you're sleep deprived for a week and you just missed a few hours. Well, there was a cool study published in Chest that looked at this. This looked at 8 nights of normal sleep compared to getting about 2/3 of your normal sleep. So this is something that could easily happen if even you're like, just have a busy week and you just don't have time. You got to spend more time at the office. You're frazzled. So you're just getting slightly less sleep over the course of a week. This is where it gets crazy. The sleep deprived group ended up consuming 559 more calories per day on average. What the heck? Whereas the group that was fully rested, the control group, actually consumed about 118 calories less. That's a 677 calorie difference between the two groups. That adds up tremendously. Over the course of a week, we're talking a pound, give or take, of fat potentially. That's unbelievable just by being sleep deprived versus rested. Now, if that doesn't make you want to prioritize sleep, I don't know what will. But what's actually very wild about this was that there was no change in hunger hormones. They didn't see a change in ghrelin or things that would normally make people hungry. So we look at another study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and this clears it up a little bit more. They found that when people were sleep deprived, there was more neuronal activity in response to food pictures or food in general. So like the idea of food just lit up the brain more, made people want to eat more. And that alone will drive your desire to eat and ultimately your caloric intake. So when you're tired, food just seems more appealing. The solution that I have for you if you are sleep deprived is to front load your day with as much protein as possible. Protein is going to satiate you and can help override these signals a little bit. So you want to eat those eggs, you want to eat the steak, you want to eat the protein. Get what you can in. I put a link down below for the protein shake that I recommend having in the morning. It is technically a plant-based protein shake. It's one from SunWarrior, but I like it because I feel like I actually get nutritional value out of it because A, the fiber, it also has probiotics in it, it has digestive enzymes in it, and it's utilizing pumpkin seed protein, which is going to be rich in zinc, but also gives us the protein profile that we're looking for when it's in conjunction with the other proteins. But it's a really good breakfast style shake, so I recommend this one. So you roll out of bed, you get like 5-6 hours of sleep. It's just a good one to have. Now you could go for whey, do whatever you want, but I think that you'll find this one to be really, really satiating when it comes down to wanting to kill my appetite, it kills it much more than whey does, and it has to do with the fiber and again, just the other nutrients that are in it. I feel like I'm actually getting like a wholesome meal versus just a bolus of protein via a shake. So that link down below is for 20% off whatever you want to get from SunWarrior. So that SunWarrior active protein line, again, 20% off whatever you want to get from them, but that active protein and also their Warrior blend are the ones that I would recommend. So those links down below for 20% off. What happens after 3 weeks is really wild. This is when true metabolic hormone changes start to happen. And this study was interesting because it looks at just going to bed a little bit later. This study was published in the journal Metabolism, and it had subjects just go to bed an hour and a half later than they normally do. Sometimes they'd wake up at the same time, sometimes they'd wake up later, but generally just going to bed later. And what they found that this did was it decreased their insulin sensitivity, okay, and it increased their overall cortisol, not to mention it increased their weight, and it decreased their leptin. Now, what does this mean? What does this do? Well, when we decrease our overall leptin, we're not signaling to the brain that we're satiated. If leptin is elevated, it's going to tell your brain, hey, you're satiated, you're good, but when leptin's low, the brain is seeking out food because leptin signals that there's enough food on hand. Okay. Now, additionally, what's going to happen if your insulin sensitivity goes down is that means that you have a higher rate of what's called de novo lipogenesis potentially occurring. What could happen here is that is when carbohydrates potentially turn into fat, particularly in caloric surplus. So if you're in a surplus and you eat carbohydrates, yes, you run the risk of them turning into fat. But when you're in a situation where your insulin sensitivity is low and you're in a surplus, then you run an even higher risk of it turning into fat. And where does it like to deposit? It likes to deposit in the abdominal area and in the visceral area surrounding our liver and underneath our skin surrounding our organs. Not just the subcutaneous fat, but the bad visceral fat. So hugely problematic when you have metabolic hormone changes after a few weeks. But then if we just creep it up a week more, what happens after a month is when things get really wild, because this particular study looked at people that were dieting. They were on a caloric restrictive diet. So it was published in the journal Sleep. And it had subjects go on a calorically restricted diet or calorie restriction plus sleep restriction. Guess how much though? Only restricting sleep by 3 hours over the course of a week. So really not that much sleep, but enough to clearly add up as far as the outcome. They found that the group that had restricted calories with sleep restriction lost the same amount of weight as the other group because calories were matched, but they lost less fat mass. They lost more muscle and held on to their fat. It also found that the respiratory quotient decreased. When the respiratory quotient decreased, that means that we noticed there was less fat being oxidized. So literally oxidizing less fat, and you increase glycolysis. You're increasing carbohydrate utilization, probably because the body's in a mode of stress and it's also just less efficient. Efficiency, you can run in beta oxidation and fatty acid oxidation. So because the body was so stressed, the respiratory quotient went down and they burned less overall fat. Finally, when you start creeping this up to 60 days, you have literal changes in your HDL particle size. Now, HDL cholesterol is a good cholesterol, no matter which way you spin it. Okay, no matter where you stand in the cholesterol equation, like cholesterols that are HDL are good, okay? They help us. But they also are heavily correlated with abdominal fat when the particle size is smaller. So the study that was published in Sleep Advances took a look at caloric restriction or caloric restriction plus sleep restriction again, and they found that in the caloric restriction plus sleep restriction, they both lost weight, right? But the caloric restriction and sleep restriction group had a reduction in HDL particle size. Reductions in HDL particle size are directly associated with abdominal fat, not to mention just the health effect. So there's something going on here that's actually starting to change at a much more core level when people are sleep deprived. So don't get me wrong, after 60 days, this isn't the only thing that's happening. All of the above is happening too. Everything we've talked about in conjunction with this, with the exception of maybe the total sleep deprivation study, because you're not totally sleep deprived every night. But a couple things to keep in mind. If you do not sleep well, like one night, don't panic, just increase your protein and decrease your carbohydrates a little bit that day, unless you feel extra stressed and you're active. If you're stressed, but you're active, carbohydrates can blunt cortisol, because insulin will blunt cortisol. But what I don't want you to do is say, I didn't sleep well, let me eat a bunch of carbohydrates and not be active. What I would recommend is say, hey, if you're ultra stressed out, a few carbs might help you get through a workout, but you're much better off just spiking your protein throughout the day and going into damage control mode. You're not going to be breaking records with sleep deprivation, but you can at least prevent some of the breakdown. So go into damage control mode, increase your protein intake, and just stop the breakdown and focus on getting your sleep back on track before you try to set any records. I'll see you tomorrow.